Welcome to Missing Capitalism. This is Josh. In this two-part episode, I'm joined by special co-host PM, and we speak with veteran civil rights organizer Eric Mann about his journey from his upbringing in New York to his involvement in the political struggles in the 1960s. Mann discusses his early influences, including his parents' activism. He reflects on his work with the Congress of Racial Equality and Snick, highlighting key campaigns such as Trailways boycott and the 1968 Columbia University student strike. Mann also recounts his time as a political prisoner, offering insights into the carceral state and the impact of incarceration on his life and activism. He emphasizes the importance of building a Black-led united front against imperialism and shares his ongoing work with the Labor Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles. Mann's narrative highlights the importance of organizing strategic alliances in the ongoing struggle for liberation. Eric Mann is the co-director of the Labor Community Strategy Center in South Central Los Angeles. He's the author of Comrade George, an investigation into the life and political thought and Assassination of George Jackson, Playbook for Progressives, The 16 Qualities of a Successful Organizer, and the forthcoming We Made the Revolution with Our Bodies on the Line. PM Irvin is a PhD candidate researching the political thought of W.E.B, Du Bois, and 20th century Black radicalism. If you like what we do and want to support our ability to have more conversations like this, please consider becoming a patron. You can do so for as little as $1 a month. We bring you these conversations totally independently with no corporate state or grant funding. Now, here is Eric Mann discussing his life and work. Okay, so I'm here today with Eric Mann. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. It is such an honor to be in dialogue with you. And I want to start by allowing you the space to talk a bit about your early life and how you got involved in political struggles in the long 1960s. But before we even get to that point, maybe talk a bit about your upbringing, which could maybe set the stage for how you were spurred into political activity and in and immediately after college.
Yeah, but I want to start by thanking you, Josh, and you, PM, because a lot of my work is based on the concept of having a planned and conscious character. Got that from Lenin, but I got it from almost every successful organization. Can't just wake up and do something. There's a lot of preparation, a lot of thinking. So I want the millennials that join capitalism listeners to know that PM and Josh and I have been working on these questions and thinking about them. We had a prep meeting that I've been prepping all morning. It takes time to really think of what you think. And I know these stories, and yet each time I reinterrogate them because they need to be new. If you play in jazz, you don't play the same thing every time. So I just want to thank both of you for being really good partners, and I'm ready to go.
Yeah, awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Appreciate it.
So now, what was the question?
If you just talk a bit about your upbringing, which help us understand better how you were able to be spurred into political activity in the 60s.
I appreciate that because there's too much resentment of parents by children, and we're all the product of our parents. And then we get to develop ourselves independent of them, influenced by them. We take what we like, what was good, we change. But I'm very lucky because I'm very loyal to my parents who did really good by me. And I'm definitely a product of my parents and my grandmother and my brother. Let me start there. I always thought I'm a Jew from Brooklyn because that's my preliminary identity. It still retains my identity. But I think I'm now a civil rights organizer, a person deeply committed to the Black and Third World movements, an anti-imperialist. But I'm still a Jew from Brooklyn, and I'm still a product of all the people who have touched my life. Let me start with my parents. My joke is that the first words that came out of their mouth was "those fascist bastards," because that's all I heard growing up, especially from my mom. I was born in 1942, December to almost 1943, in the middle of the Great War against fascism. And my father was my father's name was Howard Mann. He was in the infantry, so he could have been killed. And when I was born, he was not there. My mother raised me at least 2 years before I met my dad. And she went to the Jewish Women's Hospital and in Brooklyn, and something said they didn't have a bed ready. She said, "Tell you what, I'm going to call the press and tell them that you're denying a Jewish woman entrance to the Jewish Women's Hospital." And they said, "All right, we found a room." So that was my mom, a fierce fighter, grew up in a foster home, a self-constructed intellectual, and just a warrior, and also an intellectual warrior, meaning she took ideas very seriously, which I'll get to. And then my dad, Howard Mann, he was a union organizer, and where he had been. So he was an organizer with the Textile Workers Union. He went down south. He organized black and white textile workers. So I get a lot of that organizing background from my dad. My dad was also a fierce anti-communist. He was a socialist with the Young People's Socialist League, YPSO, and the Socialist Party, Norman Thomas. He hated the communists. There was a book in my house called Heresy Yes, Conspiracy No, by this arch anti-communist Sidney Hook. And the argument was that you're allowed to have heresy, but the communists were launching a conspiracy. So socialists should support the Taft-Hartley law, should support McCarthy. Pretty bad. But the main aspect of my dad was very positive. And he exposed me to books. I still remember there's a book called Organized Labor and the Negro, which I just remember seeing, a book title can just shake your life. I went and found it online. It still exists in the used bookstore. My family fled the pogroms in the 1880s from Bala Russia. The pogroms, for the listeners, is anti-Jewish riots, abuses. We used to go from the Cossacks, and then the Goyim, which I'll talk about. So they would go in and beat up, burn down Jewish ghettos and kill Jewish children. And so my families were refugees, as Leanne, my wife, says, not immigrants. They fled anti-Semitism. They landed in England, and they came to Brooklyn, the center of all Jewish landings. My mom told me that the Jews and the Negroes were in the same boat, and the Goyim were out to get us. That America's filled with fascists. The war was over. So where did all the German fascists go? Now nobody's a fascist. But Eric, I was there in the 30s when the Germans were fascists. And they're here. Werner von Braun is running the space program. My mom was fierce like that. And she had that intellectual edge. And she also hated the Goyim. The Goyim are non-Jews. That is to say, it's a Jewish-centric view of the world. And everyone else, mainly Christians, white Christians, are Goyim. It reached the point where my mom was a great shopper because she grew up in the Depression. And everything had to be on sale. And she had so many jokes like, if it's 20% off, that's the Goyim discount. Jews only get 50% off, we don't buy. So the edge of being the other, being a despised people, being hated, persecuted, prosecuted, was in my soul. So by the time I met the Black movement, I used to say I thought I was enraged, and they raised rage to a whole nother level, but I could match it. I felt that. And more on that, but yeah, and then I had a couple of other thoughts. I'm trying to figure out my deep love for the Black community and at a very visceral level. When I was 13, my dad, who did a lot of really good things for me, he took me to Philadelphia to meet with this guy, Eugene Wayman Jones. You should look him up. He was a critical kind of Black figure in the Black cultural world. He was gay, queer, at the time, very out. And he ran this thing called the Philadelphia, probably Black and African Cotillion, which was a big event, a 3-day event. I was 13. And my dad just said, go work with Gene. And Gene was so nice to me. He said, this is Eric, it's Howard's son. And he introduced me to everybody and said, he's going to work with us for a couple of days. And they said, great, here's a paintbrush, start painting. Or, hey, Eric, go get us coffee. Or, Eric. And I realized I loved work. And there was something magic about that Black community, and they took great care of me. And I felt at home there. I went to a gospel concert, and the first time I heard gospel, I was transformed. I loved that music. Just one more background is when I went to Cornell. In my summers, I worked in the South Bronx at the East Side Settlement House, which had been a Scandinavian or European settlement house on the East Side. And to give them credit, by 1960, they said, European immigrants don't need our help. Let's move to the South Bronx. And that was a Black and Puerto Rican community. And I spent 3 summers there and loved the communities, Black and Puerto Rican, loved the kids. And they loved me back. So by the time I get to core, I'm pretty well shaped. And I know what I want to do.
Yeah, thank you, Eric, for that breakdown, and all very interesting. My grandpa was actually late grandpa. It was named Howard. Funny convergences there. But so by 1964, you were involved with the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, and you did that to get involved with the civil rights struggles. And so we were curious about how this came about, and maybe if you could say a word or two about what you were doing with the organization.
Yeah, and one thing I want our listeners to know, I hope it's okay to call people listeners or comrades, is I'm almost finished with a book called We Made the Revolution with Our Bodies on the Line, The Journey of a Core SDS, UAW, and Strategies for an Organizer. And my book, which it's 2 or 3 months away from being finished after 8 years, and I'm looking right now for publishers, is a study of organization. So it's not a memoir. I reject memoir completely, because memoir, you can say whatever you want in a memoir. You're not accountable to anything, and people say terrible things. I'm treating this as an historian. And I think movement people have to learn to write history, but they also have to hold themselves to high standards of historical integrity. That's to say, the Congress of Racial Equality, which is the first chapter, I joined the Black militants, was formed in 1942 when I was born. So imagine when I show up in 1964, if I start the story there, it's very egocentric and also white-ocentric. So I went back and studied. And there's a book called Core by Elliot Rudwick, and it's a monograph. And it's phenomenal because regardless of certain interpretations, all the facts are there, which is unbelievable when people do these monographs with great contributions. So I still can make my interpretation of the fact, because, Josh, I know the last question is, as my statement, which I want to get credit for, is there's no such thing as history. There's only the struggle over historical interpretation. So I could read that monograph, and you could read it, and 20 other people could read it. But how do we weigh things? How do we reject certain ideas? How do we accept certain ideas? How much weight does this matter? What about emotion, theory? They're on the core chapter, because the book is starting with history, then organization, and then my role, often always the narrator, but sometimes a primary protagonist, sometimes secondary. But it's a story of 60 years of movement history told through the lens of these organizations. So before I get into how I joined CORE, I just want to tell people a little bit about CORE. CORE comes out of the overwhelmingly white reconciliation of, what is it called? I think it's Fellowship of Reconciliation, that's right, which was a multiracial but overwhelmingly white pacifist organization led by a man named A.J. Musty. Now, they had very strict rules about non-violence participation, passive resistance, no fighting back. If you fought back, you were part of the problem. But out of that, two people would go on to be famous. James Farmer, who became the head of Corps, and Bayard Rustin, who was a very important political figure, the lead organizer of the 1963 March on Washington. I'll go back to him, and yes, an anti-communist. They broke away, not broke away, I want to be careful because that's not right. They struggled within the Fellowship of Reconciliation to say, we want to form a Congress of Racial Equality as a spin-off, project of, not a fight against. But it still involved the fight because this was an overwhelmingly white organization, and this would be the beginning of Black leadership. But to give them credit, FOR accepted it. And they did some amazing work, sit-ins in Chicago against racial discrimination in 42, 43, 44. So I'll fast forward to 1960, when Corps is still overwhelmingly white, but significantly Black, which is pretty amazing. I've never seen white organizations can virtually never become Black or even predominantly of color. It just is the white culture is not going to be attractive to an oppressed nationality person, plus all the white chauvinism. But to give Corps credit, they attracted many Black people. And somewhere around before the explicit role of Black power, Corps went through a transformation to become a majority Black organization, which is amazing, and to their credit. And most of the whites stayed or left, but it was done with love, not hostility. So by 1961 come the Freedom Rides. And people don't understand how terrifying that was, and how one of the things, Josh and PM, I'm trying to do is make history come alive at a level that you understand you probably can't make that history. That what other people did, you and I can't make at this point in history. But we have to struggle to say, if they did this, then damn, I better do that. I better move in the direction of the best work that's ever been done, because that's all we can do. And also there were different historical conditions. There was the rise of the Soviet Union, the rise of the Cuban Revolution, the Chinese Revolution. World communism was on the rise. The U.S. was on the defensive. And the northern ruling class began to say, I think we need to challenge our partners in the South to just do the least possible for the Negro. So the Freedom Rides was an effort to challenge segregation in interstate commerce. And about 15 people, I think about half Black and half white, got on these buses and would go into segregated lunch counters on the way, lunch bathrooms on the way, and refused to agree with the whites-only, colored-only culture. And they would start getting arrested and beaten. But by the time they got to Anniston, Alabama, they were accosted by a Klan mob and beat within an inch of their lives. This white guy, Jim Peck, such a sweet man. He had an indentation in his head larger than a golf ball. And he had 100 stitches just to sew his head together. You ask anybody, Bob Moses, Fannie Lou Hamer, anybody who went south or was south, the level of physical brutality by and I want to say the Northern Capitalist Klan, which ran the Southern Capitalist Klan. This started in the North by then, and that's another conversation. So people were, if you joined Corps, you had to put your body on the line, which is the name of my book. And just hop up and a little back is when I went into my interview at Corps in 1964, September, I was interviewed by Lou Smith. Lou Smith was one of the leaders of the Black militants who had not taken over Corps, but was a dominant factor and Factor and Core. And he interviewed me. He said, "Why do you want to join Core?" I said, "Because you are the most militant fighters. I respect you so much. I'll do anything. I'll do any job you got." And I meant licking envelopes. That's another thing I want people to understand. When you join an organization, start by sweeping the floor. Start by doing the dishes. Respect the structure of what you walked into. And he said, "Are you willing to join the revolution against the system? Are you willing to fuck it up? Stand up to it. Discredit it. Throw yourself in front of the gears. Stop it from working. Are you willing to be a soldier in the army? And are you ready to put your body on the line?" They didn't ask what's your position on the national question, what's your relationship with socialism and imperialism. And yes, there's a little critique of that. They said, "We are trying to make a revolution now against the white settler state, and we know what to do. But the key is, are people willing to make the sacrifice and put their body on the line?" So between 1961, I'll come back to 64, Core put its body on the line, and then they reached the point they couldn't do anymore. And Diane Nash and the Young Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee started another leg of it. So by the time I get involved, just 2 or 3 thoughts, and we'll come back to the stall and Josh, that I know you want to talk about. But the transformative moment in my life was in June 1964. I'm just graduated from Cornell. I'm in the South Bronx in another settlement house. I don't know what I'm going to do, but I know it has something to do with civil rights. Am I going to be a civil rights lawyer? Perhaps. I think I had some individualistic fantasies. And then I heard that James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner were missing in Meridian, Mississippi. And within a day, everybody knew they had been killed. And then it took a few weeks for them to find the bodies. And that raised the question for me, because I've been very deeply moved by Emmett Till, Medgar Evers, the 4 girls in the Birmingham church, James Chaney. But here were 2 white Jewish guys from New York, exactly my age. I could have been them. I admired them so much. And I had to think, are you willing to do what they did? I'll come back to it. I wasn't as willing to go south, which we'll talk about, but I wanted to join Core. So I went in for this interview, and to my shock, I was given the job of field secretary, which is a big honor. As field staff, the people in the South in Snick are called field secretaries. I was a field secretary, meaning an organizer for the organization. The other thing, and you'll ask me more questions, is, and this is another important point, Core was fundamentally a voluntary organization. So I do not have the same critiques of nonprofits that other people have. We'll come back to that. But the key thing is, a good organization has to be 90% volunteer with a small staff. And you need a staff. Core chapters, imagine 100 Core chapters all over the country. Syracuse Core, Philadelphia Core, St. Louis Core, LA Core, San Francisco Core, in New York, Brooklyn Core, Bronx Core, Harlem Core, Long Island Core, Bed-Stuy Core, Jamaica Core. Each one of those was a self-generating chapter with its own elections, its own officers, its own leaders. And Core was a federation of chapters. And the chapters had a lot of power, because the national office could not come, nor would it come in and with edicts and they were going to do this. It had to lead to the process of persuasion. It would come in and say, "I have a great idea," and you have to get Brooklyn Core's vote and Bronx Core's vote, and the organization would move. And a lot of my job was working with the chapters, with the leaders. And again, as a white Jewish man, when I would go to Baltimore, I would go into the Black community and I would sleep in the home of the core chapter chair, who was Black. And he would be the trainer for me. He would talk to me about the history of Baltimore, what core is doing. He would take me under his arm and be my teacher. Then I go to GC Corps. I sleep on another couch or bed. There's sometimes a bedroom. And those core leaders would train me and talk to me. So another thing about an organizer, you have to be a good listener. And certainly for a white organizer, if you want to work with Black people and win their trust, you have to be a very good listener.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. And a couple of things you touched on, we're going to get into like later in the call. But you did work for one of the more militant chapters of CORE as a field secretary. And as you mentioned, so can you discuss some of your work with the chapter, though, more specifically, especially interested in the proposed Stalin to integrate the 1964 World's Fair, I think it's pronounced. And
yeah. And George, I'm going to talk about two things. I was not there during Stalin, but it's in a critical story and shaped my decision to join CORE, which is...
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha.
And I remember that, which is very important because I was there when everybody was arguing about it.
Gotcha.
So what happened was, and this is another example of the CORE chapters, Brooklyn CORE, led by Oliver Leeds and Reverend Milton Galamison, and Bronx CORE, led by Herb Callender, decided that they were a little more than tired, that the World's Fair, which is a international imperialist exhibition, every country has its own pavilion to show off its culture. The World's Fair, it's run by the capitalist class, and it's constructed out of nowhere. So it was constructed in a place called Flushing Meadows in Queens. Tons of new jobs. I mean, everything, especially construction jobs. But as always, the white construction workers were fiercely racist, armed racist. And we'll come back to this, but I do not believe there is a white working class. I think anybody who says you're in the white working class knows very much what you're saying, which is you're against the Black working class. You're against the Latino working class. They are all white people who are workers. But I know a lot of white workers who never said, I'm in the white working class. So anytime you hear from Bernie Sanders say, why don't we pay more attention to the white working class? You might as well just say, why don't we pay attention to the Klansmen and the fascists who are trying to kill us? So CORE was tired of picketing, which wouldn't have done anything. And they came up with the idea of the Stalin. The Stalin was that on the first day of the World's Fair, CORE captors were to take beat-up old cars with just enough gas to get on the freeway. And they would purposely run out of gas and stall in create the greatest traffic jam in the history of New York freeways and prevent people from going to the World's Fair. The reaction was fierce by the whites, the white power structure, and some Black people too. You can't do this. Can't do this. What if a baby dies? Now, of course, babies were dying every day in Harlem and no one cared. But all of a sudden, it's a hypothetical baby on the way to the World's Fair. We got to worry about this. And Mayor Robert Wagner, a dog, said, when his father was the Wagner of the Wagner Act, which is also a dog because it was against Black workers, he said, CORE is putting a gun to the heart of New York City. Now, Howard Zinn said, nonviolence includes a Stalin. Nonviolence can even involve breaking machinery, which nobody knows. Nonviolence simply means do not hit people. And that's very important because the Black militants mostly were not trying to hit people. They were not, that would have been wrong, but that was not their theory. The theory was, as Lou Smith said, fuck up the structure, go into a White Castle in Bronx, stop it, sit in, You can throw food. So this was different than passive resistance. This is what's called nonviolent direct action. So nonviolent direct action was fucking up the World's Fair. And the whole country was debating this. And that's a very important way called counter-hegemonic organizing, where the movement goes on the offensive and everybody has to debate it. And everybody is speaking against the Stalin. So I'm at Cornell. I'm in 1963 when this is happening, summer of 63. I don't remember what I thought. I'm sure when I began, my reaction would not have been positive. But listening to the debate, and hearing people say, hey, they know I'd right to do this, they're going to kill us, to listen to the voice in my own head, the racist voice in my own head, I said, no, I don't want to be that person. No, and sometimes you'll see somebody doing stuff that you don't like, and you go, oh my God, that could be me. If you're good, if you notice stuff. So I listened to that voice, and I realized they have every right to do this. Now, there's a wonderful quote in my book by Lorraine Hansberry, shortly before she died. And there was a town hall in New York City, a big debate, between a lot of liberals. And Lorraine Hansberry said, when I first heard about the Stalins, I was horrified. I did not support it, even though my father had led the fight for desegregation in housing in Chicago. But again, listening to all the white people screaming, you can't do this, you have no right to do this, you're hurting us, I began to realize everything else we've tried has failed. And Brooklyn and Bronx Core have got it right. We need to escalate, and we're asking white people of goodwill to support this. And I decided I really want to support this, and I want to congratulate CORE. And she actually raised money for CORE to get a station wagon that was sent to the South, and that was the station wagon that Mickey Schwerner and Andy Goodman and James Chaney used to get to the church where they were murdered. So what is the point? That the Black movement, and even today, under much more difficult situations, each of us still has to find something that pushes the envelope beyond what people think you should do. This has to be done very carefully with a mass support. But if they're not debating you, then you're not making any history. And I read the New York Post because I'm a sports addict. Every single headline is anti-Palestine, anti-Zionist Jews, anti-Columbia University. And I think, God bless you, you're doing great. You're doing great. Tremendous courage, which we'll come to. You're moving history forward. And Israel is losing the damn debate, finally, which is why the brutality on both U.S. and Israeli is even getting worse. They cannot allow an extended fight over this which they're still willing, because they know all the illusions about the Holocaust and Jews and Israel being the chosen people. Nobody believes that anymore, except the hardcore Zionists. So what I learned from CORE was take militant action, force everybody to debate you, and you will recruit people to you. Now, here's the irony. The Stalin never happened. But nobody knows that, because CORE and Brooklyn CORE and Bronx CORE did not, in fact, have the capacity to carry this out. Plus, when Mayor Wagner said, you're putting a gun to the heart of New York, that was very clear what he's saying. I'm going to put a gun to the heart of you. And a lot of people felt like the idea that Stalin had already achieved its goal, But if we're taking a car out and we're black, any motorist could beat us up, any cop could beat us up, we could be killed in the Stalin. So that day, the traffic was still much less. But nobody knows the Stalin did happen, is my point. The Stalin happened, and how many cars came was not the point. It shaped history, and it's a terrific model. That's the Stalin. Thoughts on that, and then I go to my work on the actual Trailways boycott, which is the work I did do.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. And moving along a little bit, and this is before you worked along.
I'll move faster.
No, you're perfectly fine. I promise. I wasn't saying it because of that. I was saying that like we're moving to a different, like shifting to a different like area of like, organizing, if that makes sense. And yeah, in 1964, you worked alongside Ralph Featherstone and Snick to protect sharecroppers. Featherstone, by the way, I should provide some context, was killed in a blast outside of where Jamil Al-Amin with Charles was taking place in 1970. So can you talk a little bit about your time in and around Snick? I feel like your work there can shed a light on your own ideological and political commitments today, but also the work you were involved in CORE after you had graduated as well, like as you just mentioned, or whatever the case is. But yeah.
We all love Snick, even those in CORE. So it's, I don't know, a big sister. It wasn't quite like that, but we had no competition. I've been talking about an important concept that between CORE and Snick was a semi-permanent. We were virtually one organization. Imagine that. Not an ounce of competition about money, about ego, because everybody was putting their bodies on the line. So, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I urge you to read In Struggle, Snick, and the Black Awakening of the 1960s by Claiborne. It's an amazing book. I've taught it, read it 5 times at least. It's another one of those apps that tells the history in such brilliant detail. And there's nothing Snick, the new album by Howard Zinn, which is a more emotional view. They're both phenomenal. So the other thing is books, folks. Read. When I was in CORE, check out Gabe Ganis. He's still alive. One of the greatest. He was an icon at 23 years old. He was in CORE, the Southern staff. When they came up, people in the North were in awe of them. Jerome Smith and many others, and Bob Moses and Richard Haley, Jim McLean. Every one of them has put their body on the line at a level that cannot be comprehended. So when Gabe Ganis was in Mississippi, because CORE, another great thing, you should really read it, and if you read my book, because it really is a great chapter. CORE was the only group that had work in the North, the West, the East, and the South. CORE had a really big New Orleans project, but it was a big part of Mississippi Summer, the Congress of Federated Organizations, which also included the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. But Dave Dennis tells the story that when he was in Mississippi and met Bob Moses, he told the CORE leadership, but he was the head of the Mississippi Project, I want to work closely with Bob Moses. And he had the power to do that. That is to say, he thought Bob Moses was so brilliant as an organizer, he wanted to be with him. And the two of them went on to form the Algebra Project. Bob Moses died a few years ago. The two of them have been friends forever. So in that context, when I was in CORE, I also worked with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, which is a long story, which I will not tell, but after they were sabotaged at the 1964 Democratic Party convention by Lyndon Johnson, they still stayed in Congress to fight for certain other rules about allowing Black-led Mississippi Party. So I went down to Baltimore. I met with Lawrence Guillot. And later I'll tell you about how I met Fannie Lou Hamer and Bob Moses in SDS in Newark in 67. What's my point? That Tom Hayden, brilliant guy, who founded SDS, first came out of Snick and the Freedom Ride. So Core and Snick did the Freedom Ride. The white SDS people came out of the Freedom Ride. So by the time I go to D.C., I'm trying to stop, you can imagine this, a Department of Labor program in the summer of 1965 that allegedly is going to give Black and Puerto Rican children an opportunity in the countryside. Turns out they're going to be brought in as strikebreakers against the braceros and the whole farm worker organizing. So I get wind of it. I'm sent down by George Wiley, my associate director of Core, and I see what's going on. I realize we have to blow the whistle on it. So I call the D.C. office, and Ralph Featherstone opens it up, or answers the phone, who's the head of the D.C. office. Now, he doesn't owe me a hole in the wall. I say, Ralph, my name is Eric Mann. I'm a field secretary of the Corps. He said, great, what can I do? You got me. I said, there's this meeting going on in D.C. tomorrow, and we need to blow it up and challenge. And I laid it out in 2 minutes. And he said, okay, I'm there. Come on over, let's get a cup of coffee so we know what we're doing. So that was the relationship of SNCC and Core. We don't have that today at all. There are no semi-permeable memories. The organization's boundaries are so strict now. You can't, it's a coalition to rule. Yeah, may have a friend in there, but they are organizationally identified. And the strategy center is not as much. We really will come to that. We want alliances, we want relationships, and we do a pretty good job of doing it. So what is my point? The success of the 1960 to 69 period came out of deep personal commitments between Core, SNCC, and SDS. And SNCC was still the most successful militant group in the South. We also have Harry De Rofante involved, Sidney Poitier involved. We'll get to the role of Nina Simone, Lorraine Hansberry, Lena Horne, the role of Black musicians and artists.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was really interesting. And while we're talking about the South, especially, so I have a question about your involvement and how you are viewing the South as the sort of vanguard. So our understanding is that a lot of your involvement, if not most, was mostly in the North, right? But you saw and maybe still see the Southern struggle as the cutting edge of the social revolution. So can you talk a bit about this a little bit, and why do you think this is so important in your estimation?
Again, Josh and PM, these questions are wonderful because they lead into, of course, the questions, the answers, and the questions lead into important political theory. Of course, I believe that Black people in the United States are an oppressed nation. I'm not trying to engage in ideological debates, but I think all Black people in the United States are one oppressed nation. But the Black Belt South in the South is a fascist country inside a fascist country. It's the most extreme, perpetual police state run by the most intense racial antagonism, lynching. Du Bois said in one of his many anti-lynching efforts to get an anti-lynching bill, and I don't remember the year, but I'll say in 1 year, more than 1,000 people were lynched. Think about that. If one person is lynched, what about the role of psychic terror in the Black soul? 1,000 people lynched means every one of you could be that person. And when you see the pictures of the white people celebrating it, going out as if it was an activity, I'm very anti-white not all white people, but the general idea we have to remember, this is a white settler state. And I urge people to start saying, of all races, wake up in the morning and say, this is just my idea. I live in the U.S. imperialist, genocidal, white settler state. And then you say, why is Trump doing what he's doing? Why are the Democrats doing what they're doing? Why? Because I live in the U.S. imperialist, genocidal, white settler state. So you go back to that, and the hellacious role of white inferiority, I won't use the word white supremacy. Imagine that the poorest white in the world could see a black man of any economic level walk down a street. And if that man looked him in the eye, he could be lynched or shot or beaten with no chance of prosecution. So imagine 20 million black people living under constant fear of death and murder. And the bowed head, it's a miracle that black people stood up. And Jim Crow was just the continuation of the enslavement. And so in the South, with full support of the North, by the way, it was a racist concentration camp, a permanent concentration camp for all the black people there. So when Core and Snick and King decided to focus on the South, it wasn't because the North wasn't phenomenally racist, but they had to break the back of the worst military dictatorship and violence against black people, state violence too. So the Montgomery bus boycott was phenomenal, but that was in a city that had enough, I'll say liberalism not being a great word, but decency on some level, that people were not killed. And they were able to win that because they had the right to organize even those tremendous retaliation against the black domestic workers. But as you went further south, couldn't do anything. So when in fact there's a great story, there's another book, I've Got the Right of Freedom, Mississippi and the organizing tradition, and I'll get the name of the author. It's another one of those great books that goes into tremendous detail of what that organizing looked like. But the particular great story about leadership is there was a man in Mississippi named Amzie Moore, A-M-Z-I-E Moore. He had been there forever, and he was leading resistance in Mississippi, including the fact that almost everybody in Mississippi, every black person in Mississippi was armed. Not walking down the street armed, but virtually every house was armed, assuming the Klan was going to come. Amzie Moore was at the head of the NAACP in Mississippi. Bob Moses comes down. I don't remember if he's Howard, I think, at that time. And he meets Amzie Moore. And the two of them build a phenomenal relationship in which the college-educated black man and the still highly educated black man in Mississippi start coming up with a plan for voter registration in Mississippi. And that synthesis of the students, starting with the black students, and the black sharecroppers, the black workers, the black professionals, no one can understand what it was like to decide you're going to do that, because there was a good chance that you would be beaten within an inch of your life, and there was a good chance you would be murdered. So, when the Communist Party in 1928 and 1930, and I urge you to read the Comintern's resolution on the Afro-American national question, 1928-1930, is phenomenal in its level of specificity. Now, at that time, the Communist Party believed that the black nation existed in the Black Belt South, and that the dispersed black community in the North and West was an oppressed national minority with the right of full democratic rights. In reality, nobody debated that. Everybody knew black people were a nation. Nobody except the most sectarian want to argue that. But the South had a particular role, the sense of the sense of enslavement. And what Snick and Core did in 1964 was a revolution. And just bear with me for a minute. For people who are for socialism and communism, especially white people, there is a tendency to belittle the struggle for democratic rights as a reform versus revolution. I totally disagree. I think revolutions are made of struggles that I don't call reforms. They're struggles, anti-hegemonic struggles for democratic rights. The vote, the right of Black people to vote was a revolution, a democratic revolution inside imperialism, inside an oppressed nation. If you don't think so, how many people were murdered trying to vote? How many people, Black people, showed up at the courthouse? And all the humiliating treatment, but how 15 Black people marching, was often soldiers from World War II, and they were met with guns at the courthouse. So to say that's a reform, it's a meaningless concept. It was a struggle in the tradition of revolutions to reduce the power of white hegemonic imperialist white settler states. A revolution has many steps to it. And I'll just trip on something, PM, because I like Orsani Burton's book, which we'll come to. But there's a discussion like getting visits from your family or getting everybody a cell in the prison versus these group cells, or cutting down the brutality or shortening the sentences, or getting people to parole and off parole and getting better food in the prisons is a reform. And getting rid of the prisons is a revolution. I'll tell you this, ask any prisoner if getting more food and getting your family to visit you, getting free phone calls instead of wrecking your family's life, would you call that a reform? Believe me, that is revolutionary in experience and in theory. So I believe that the attacks on the Black people in this country are so fascist that the fight for democratic rights is revolutionary in itself.
Yes, so you also worked with Black and Puerto Rican porters to organize an extremely sophisticated and effective boycott of the Trailways Bus Company, an extremely white, racist, and Southern company. So may you talk a bit about how this came about and how you were able to have such a material impact on the conditions of workers there, considering it did help lead to the desegregation of the company?
One of the themes that I want to talk about, because in my book, and I'm sorry, that's what authors always say in my book, my wife Leanne and I had worked on this book for 7 years. And my wife Leanne, who you'll hear about a lot, is a Marxist, anti-imperialist, feminist, does a lot of work on Muriel Mies, capitalism, accumulation on a world scale. Hope that's the right name. And we read a lot of the kind of third world feminism and Marxist feminism, which is very critical. So when she was working with me on my book, because we're getting close to the end, she said, Eric, what are the through lines? Because every chapter is great, but I don't think you've yet let the listeners know, the readers, that you have 6 or 7 theoretical premises. And therefore that runs through every chapter. It's a 60-year or 100-year or 500-year theory. So I don't have it in front of me, but I'm going to say what they are. The first is the strategy, is we have to build a Black-led, Black and Third World-led united front against U.S. and European imperialism. Everything I've done from 1960 has been based on that. The second is that nothing could be possible without the building of organizations. And those organizations have to reflect the strategy of the Black-led Third World United Front against U.S. imperialism. Then, within that, you need a demand set of structures. And demand development is something that we're going to do, whether we do 2 or 3 of these shows, which I'd love, is in many ways, demand development is the key to what your real politics are. Because if you have 3 things to decide on, nothing wrong with that. If you say the 3 things are housing, environmental, degradation, and education, that's not fair. If you don't say Black education and the colonial nature of it, if you don't have a demand about Palestine and Vietnam and Cuba and China, if you don't say self-determination for the people of China or the People's Republic of China, U.S. hands off Venezuela and the Third World, you're still operating inside a U.S. imperialist, and I will say then reform strategy, as radical as it is, because you accept the U.S. nation state. So the theory has to be there, then the organization has to be there, then the demands have to be there. Then you need campaigns. Because what I want to tell the people of Colombia, who I just admire the hell out of, and I know they know this, but picture this as a 10-year campaign. We know 10 years from now, Palestinian people will still be there. We know 10 years from now, U.S. imperialism will still be there. We know 10 years from now, the Israeli fascists will be there. But the balance of forces can shift. There can be an extension of the Palestinian struggle, a decline in the influence of Israel, decline of the United States, to the point where at some point, they may abandon Israel. If they think the world balance of forces is not going their way, they may decide, given the contradictions in the Arab world, that Israel is no longer serving its purpose. So the reason I say that is you have to have a long trajectory and figure out where you want to go. And then you have to have a campaign to get you there. Now, the campaign could be something like fighting for the right to wear masks in demonstration in Colombia. Right? The campaign could be no expulsions. The campaign can be free Mahmoud Khalid. It doesn't have to be the longest, but those campaigns will take time. You don't just demand them, you got to win them. And as you said, a sophisticated campaign where you have a tactic and a theory, and how are you going to get the trustees, and how are you going to get the president, or how are you going to get this department to take a stand? How are you going to get this union to take a stand? It's organizing. And without organizing, your theory is good, your strategy is good, your organization is good, your demands are good, but it's one in the realm of organizing, and that's around campaigns. So the demands have to be reflected in the campaigns. Then you need to train organizers, because campaigns are carried out by organizers. And I've written this book called Playbook for Progressives, the 16 qualities of a successful organizer. And I would love if we could do a Millennials Are Killing Capitalism teaching on that book, because I assume a lot of people listening have really good politics and they're doing stuff already. But how to be a successful organizer is like how to be a successful brain surgeon. It's not easy, folks. Failure is the norm. I fail a lot through my own mistakes or things I didn't assess. So I think teaching organizing as a theory, which we'll come back to, is critical. And then the next one is that we have to build in the United Front. We have to avoid any forms of sectarianism, any forms of picking unnecessary fights with each other. Because you can't have a united front against anything if you can't get along with other forces who do not share your views or often don't share your interests. Like, let's say Somebody may say at Columbia, I think you have a right to wear a mask, but I support Israel. It is hypothetically possible. It really is. Or at least I don't fully support this. Or I don't agree with what you did, but you shouldn't be punished for it. You're looking to find unity with people more than disagreement because you'll be isolated. And I'm good at that. I think everybody's got a left wing. You just got to find it. Now, that's an exaggeration, but more people than you think, if you approach them from a sense of decency and modesty and bring a real human question to them, whether they're Catholic or religious or humanist or capitalist, some part of them says, I don't like to admit it, but they raised a good point. And that challenges my value system. I won't do everything they want, but yeah, I don't think they should be repressed, which is a big thing right now. So thanks for letting me do that, because that will frame the conversation. And one more through line, which I realize, which is what started this, Josh, is the central role of what we call a strategic alliance. And I got this from the League of Revolutionary Struggle. The strategic alliance between the multinational working class and their oppressed nationality people. And let me take a minute on this because it's another, I think, very helpful concept I use all the time, which is a lot of people, when they discuss class, discuss it almost colorblind, which means racist. They think, yeah, race is for the Black community, but let's get to class, which is the real issue. Yeah, it is the real issue, but it's the Black working class. It's the Latino working class. It's the Black women's working class. It's mainly the oppressed nationality working class. And we want to get some white workers in there, but no, it's not multiracial. And listen to some groups, when you watch them say we have to organize the multiracial working class, what they're saying is, I do not believe in the national question. I do not want to give a racial structure to how the class structure is, because in a racist society, the class structure lines up with the race structure. So what does that mean? It means that the Black community is a multi-class, broad united front fighting for national liberation. If it's not, it has no chance. And the reason I know that is I always, when people say it's class, I say, let me ask you this. Ask a Black queer person, Black doctor, Black astronaut, Black woman, Black trans person, Black worker, Black biker, Black singer, what's the primary thing that defines them? And what a shock. It will be Black. They will not say I'm a singer or a dancer or a trans, or they will say I'm Black and queer. That's been my experience. 90% more than that. So what does that mean? That's the basis for national liberation struggle. That Black people know they're an oppressed nation inside the United States. You don't have to fight with people about, is it in the South, is it this, is it, no, it's Black people know they're oppressed inside a white settler state. And how they deal with this, how they try to adjust, is a reflection of the oppression they face and not a criticism of their consciousness. You know, a lot of people do not want to discuss reparations. They'll say, I can't go back there, damn it. I don't want to keep going back to the transatlantic slave trade. I know it better than you. And other people say, I want to. But again, the key to organizing is mutual respect and affection. And people trust me a lot. They do. They tell me stuff. I don't know. I'll talk to them for 3 minutes and people start telling me about their lives because they know I care. And they will tell me their contradiction. And when I say they, it's almost always a Black person, and that's where I live. That's where I work. Sometimes I've lived. But in the Black community, and I've also been in Chicano studies. I've organized white workers in white prisons. We'll get to. Every person has a story they want to tell you. And if you don't get that story, you have no capacity to do anything with them, work with them, change their mind. And I have my story. And if somebody says I suffer from depression, I say, so do I. If they say I have this issue, I say, yeah, I had a back problem too. I'm not doing it for false empathy. I live in the real world too. So now we're going to get to this theory of the Black and Puerto Rican workers. One of the themes that I didn't even realize in my life until I did the book is almost all my work in the Black and Puerto Rican community, with some exceptions, has been with the Black, Puerto Rican, and Chicano working class. At core, which I'll talk about, east of the Trailways, boycott. Whenever it's in Newark, I lived in the Black ghetto of the poorest of the poor, lower working class, upper working class, welfare working class, women working class. Then when I went to SDS, I worked with the Black workers in Roxbury who were trying to get hired at Tufts University, and we almost got killed by those white workers. And then, of course, I worked 10 years in a factory, 3 years as an operating room orderly. Now I work overwhelmingly with bus riders who are overwhelmingly Black and Latino workers and women. So it's very important that I'm still in the Black United Front, but I pay particular strategic attention to the role of the Black, Puerto Rican, Chicano, Mexicano, Latinx women, working class, inside their race. So thanks for letting me do that. And the first time I got the consciousness is when I worked at CORE. We had a hotline. People were calling CORE 24/7. And part of my staff job is 1 day a week I did the hotline, which I love. And people would call up and say, I still remember the guy said, I bought a car. They threw every single extra on the car. I thought it was a great idea. Until I got home and realized, oh my God, I paid $15,000 more than the car was worth, or that I should have. Now that was an element of bias remorse. Still, he was Black and said, the man cheated me. And we always say the answer is, if you're Black, yes, they cheated you, they should get your money back to be able to get a different car. But I have to be able to say to him, sir, I'm sorry. CORE does not handle individual cases. But I often had a referral. There's a consumer group here that might help you. Where do you live? We always got it into a yes with somebody, not I don't help it. Not I can't help you, but CORE cannot march into that dealer, but you do have some rights. Let me see what I can do to help you. So I had to become very knowledgeable about the social services to help people. So then I get a call, this guy, Eddie Barnes, and he calls me up and says, so my name is Eddie Barnes. I'm a porter. Porter is somebody who lifts bags. And at the Port Authority Terminal in New York, I work for the Trailways Bus Company. And I took a test to be a bus driver and an information clerk and a ticket agent, and I was told I failed. But I subpoenaed my test score. And it turned out I got one of the highest test scores in the damn history of the country. And that story alone is heartbreaking. How many Black people say about DEI? We don't need DEI for damn sake. The majority will be Black. That's right. So how sad in the white settler state, the U.S. imperialist genocide of white settler state, that we need a 14th Amendment, civil rights, Brown versus Board of Education, affirmative action, and DE, and no matter what, they will not let Black people get the jobs for which they are qualified. So then I said to Eddie, I'm really sorry, that sounds great, but I can't do individual cases. And he said, what makes you think it's an individual case? You don't let me finish. I got a caucus of Black and Puerto Rican. We got 10 of us. And we're coming to CORE as a group fight against Trailways. And we are all porters. We want to get the hell out of lifting these bags. who want to become ticket agents, information clerks, and drivers. And I got a guy, Big Sam, and Noel Quinones. Can you come over? I said, sorry. I said, listen, I'll be over there as fast. How fast can I get over there? The next day, I meet with this amazing caucus of 10 Black and Puerto Rican workers. My friend Manuel Criollo, who I worked with at the Strategy Center for 15 years, and was looking at my book, said, remember to focus on Black worker self-organization. That is to say, those workers already had organized. They did not come to CORE as isolated people. They already had something going. And they went to the CORE because we had more muscle, and them plus us, we thought we would kick Trailways ass. So I met with them and I was thrilled. I was just thrilled that Eddie Barnes was one of those advanced workers, called the advanced worker. And the advanced worker is this worker that is already leading the struggle, has the confidence of the masses, is open to revolutionary ideas. That was Eddie. I mean, and so was Noel. It was nice to be a Puerto Rican brother. And Big Sam, it was just big and militant. So I went back to CORE. And this is about how organizations work. So I went to my supervisor, Lou Smith. I went to my supervisor, George Wiley, and my supervisor, Joyce Ware. I said that. Lou Smith, Joyce Ware, and George Wiley. I said, listen, I think this could be something big. First of all, it's in New York at the Port Authority. They're a Southern company. They have Trailways, just Greyhound stops at every damn city. They have a lot of buses that go into the Deep South. And this could be a test case, especially because these workers, we're not saving them. We're helping them. And a good organization has to decide. It was totally appropriate, by the way, for George to say, Eric, great if we had 9 field secretaries, but let me show you our priorities. I don't think you can do this. And I would have negotiated with George, said, George, I'll do it on my Sundays off. I'll do it whatever the hell. I promise it won't be a priority, but I can give them some help. And he said, that sounds good. But and then we'll give it an hour, Eric, 4 hours. That's cool. So I'd say, all right. But he said, no, I agree with you. Plus, it'll allow us to get the Philadelphia chapter involved, the Baltimore chapter involved, the DC chapter involved, or the New York City chapters. So it'll also be a chapter building campaign, which is one of the criteria for a good campaign. And the other thing is, would the chapters move to this? Because if, in fact, Eric, I give you the mandate, but a Brooklyn core is not on board, and Bronx core is not on board, and Philly's not on board, and Baltimore's not on board, DC, then the campaign does not get off the ground. You understand? So inside of core, the chapters had power. Not merely power against the national organization, but power within the organization. So I would, therefore, as I would later do in SDS, so I said to the Trailways workers, I have the mandate and the go-ahead to do the trial run, and I got to go talk to the chapters about it. In the New York chapters, Eddie would come with me. We would meet with Bronx Core, Harlem Core, Brooklyn Core, Long Island Core, Jamaica, Bed-Stuy, and they loved it. And of course, they loved it because he's a real Black and Puerto Rican worker. And so I got the go-ahead. And then that became my work. I must have done other things, but I would go to Baltimore. I'd go to Philly. And we started saying we had to do a boycott. So we started going into Port Authority. Oh, we had a big demonstration at the Port Authority. Now, how the hell do I know this? But apparently the civil rights groups had made an agreement with the Johnson administration, I know, to not demonstrate during the election because of the fear of Barry Goldwater getting elected. That's a legitimate thing. Don't treat it like they sold out. It was a tactical decision that for 2 months, they did not want white fellow state to have this whole campaign be about black people. And they believed that Johnson was going to give them strong assurances, which he was, that he was going to move on to civil rights bill. So we have our first demonstration in front of the Port Authority, maybe 50 of us. And a guy named Joseph Lelybeld, check him out, Leybeld. Great guy, a reporter for the New York Times. He moved out to be one of their top people. He was also the reporter in South Africa for at least 10 or maybe 20 years, totally on the side of the ANC. So he loved CORE, and he wrote a great story on the Sunday damn front page of the New York Times. That was a fluke. And it said, first demonstration of the post-Johnson era. And one thing I'll tell organizers is, you never know. Most of the time, it breaks against you. But once in a while, just something great happens and the Red Sea opens up. So that scared the hell out of Trailways. How the hell are you on the front page of the New York Times of all things? That gave us great leverage. So then we went down to Baltimore. No, I'll do the thing in Baltimore. So we would take CORE people as ringers, meaning we didn't identify as CORE. And this woman would get in front of the line on directions. And she said, I want to go from Alaska to New Hampshire, but then I got to meet my cousin in Chicago. I want to go to South Carolina and meet my sister in Mississippi. Then I go back to Detroit. And the information clerk would start tracking this thing. And then other people in CORE in the back would go, get to the damn point, lady. You don't have all day. And then other people are yelling, yeah, this is taking too long. And people said, I'm going to Trailways. I'm going to Greyhound next door. Then when the woman bought the ticket, finally, she dumped out like 5,000 pennies. And they said, we don't take pennies. She said, this is a legal tender, sir. You're under law to take the pennies. And the guy starts counting out the pennies. The point being, it was creative tactic. And then we would picket in front, being CORE. So CORE would have the picket line, and Trailways would get a report that CORE came in and messed us up. Then we went to the New York City Commission on Human Rights, and we got a finding against Trailways. Then we went to the Office of Contract Compliance in D.C. and filed a suit against them that they couldn't get any federal money. And they were impressed. They said, there. And they settled. And interestingly, they didn't settle, which I would have loved, by sitting down with CORE and say, all right, we agree. But just the next day, Eddie gets promoted to ticket agent. And Noel Quinones is at the information clerk. And Big Sam is driving the bus. And Eddie calls me up and says, come on over, you're not going to believe this. He shows me all the caucus members have nobody is, they're still carrying bags, but they are not carrying bags, which tells the other porters, you now have a chance to get out of those job descriptions. And he said, hey, Eric, we made history together. So what did I learn? Without CORE, this doesn't happen. Without the amazing CORE chapters, this doesn't happen. Without the Black workers leading their own struggle, this doesn't happen. And yeah, without me, it doesn't happen because I'm a damn good organizer. And I was the lead organizer, and I ran from city to city and met with Eddie and met with the national office. And one thing that was interesting I realized is I did some of my best work at CORE my whole life because there was a structure for me. I was a talent, even at 21, 22. But talent can take you off the rails. Talent, there's a lot of talented people out there, but if they're not good politically, they have bad talent. But I was heavily supervised by George, again, by Herb Carrington. Oh, it's a very important story. And thanks for letting me tell it. It's about white chauvinism and consciousness. So I was the sort of main spokesperson on the Trailways campaign in the North. And I had to say, cool, going home to my apartment and seeing me on the news, which is not something you're supposed to feel. Really. But at the time I did, yeah. So Joyce Ware, my supervisor, came up to me and said, okay, you did a great job, but you're not doing any more press work. Herb Calendar's going to do the work. Now check out Herb Calendar again. I just Googled him again. Amazing. He was leader of Bronx Sport. Super and large black man who was the perfect spokesperson. And instead of saying, of course, that's great, I said, why? I'm doing a great job. I mean, Herb, with all due respect, Herb doesn't know all the facts. So Joyce said, listen, nobody in Harlem wants to see your white ass on television. Nobody wants to see that Cornell kid telling them to boycott it when they got to take a bus down to Mississippi, and Greyhound don't go there. Trailways goes there. Now, Herb Calendar says, put your trip off for a month, and they see Black Herb, who led the struggle against White Castle. They will take it seriously. But what within your heart did not understand you were the wrong person for the job? And I thought and said, damn, you're right. Completely right. I get it. It was very arrogant. Well, we didn't get into much by arrogance. She said, all right, so you can train her? I said, yeah. That was an example also of tough love. Joyce loved me and believed in me. But that's how we talked. There was nothing destructive about it. And for some of you who have thin skins, you're not going to make it. Joyce, it was treating me with respect and saying, Eric, what's wrong with you? Come on, we've been training you to be good. This is not one of your better moments. So I met with Herb, who was a hero. And Herb said, give me a few of the facts. And I did an hour background with him. And he said, I got it. Okay, cool. So what do I learn? Again, you got to be in an organization. You got to be open to organizational culture and discipline. And that's how you win. And you have to want to change. You have to have a strong desire to change and understand that you want a revolution, it starts with yourself, your own consciousness, your own false consciousness, your own good consciousness. And that's why I love organizations, always have, because people have had my back. And with a few exceptions, they haven't been destructive. And I grow. And it's one of the reasons I can still be in South Central today.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate you for that outline. So you actually left CORE. You were on good terms, but you left by the late 1960s. And I'm just curious about the internal struggles within the organization. Sure. And maybe specifically the taking a stand against the Vietnam War, of course. And a figure like Ruth Turner, for example, one of the organizations to take a firm stance, public stance against the war, while someone like James Farmer, who you mentioned earlier, felt that at that time, specific time in history, the organization cannot afford to endure the level of repression that would ensue if they did so by the Johnson administration, of course. For example, when Martin Luther King made his speech in April 1967, where he pledged, he came out against the war, of course. He suffered the very repression that CORE had feared, that James Farmer specifically had feared. So how do you see this then and today, but also today? What can we learn about how organizations handle internal contradictions in a principled and constructive manner? And what can you tell us about what we can learn about these contradictions, generally speaking?
So, Josh, I'll tell you why I like this question and why we discussed it. Because, again, I'm using, like, let's say 3 or 4 things right now. I'm obviously talking to my friends in the Black liberation movement. I'm talking to white anti-racists. I'm talking to, again, the amazing both Palestinian students, Palestinian community, all the wonderful people in the United Front to support Palestinian self-determination, to stand up to Zionist genocides. With Trump moving more rapidly, a lot of groups that have never worked together, they thought they did, but are going to have to work at a much higher level of cooperation. We're going to have to solve or have an approach to this united front, and keep using the word united front because it's not a coalition. That's a dumb word. Coalition whatever. But if you're in the United Front, well, I shouldn't, that was a little flippant. There is a coalition that plays a role, but it has to reflect the broader United Front. The United Front continues to tell yourself the enemy is more powerful than all of us put together. We live in a police state, a U.S. imperialist, genocidal, white settler state, police state. How the hell are we going to work together effectively? So let's take this example of the fight this is summer of 65, just as I'm about to leave Corps in July of 65 at the convention. By then, I am ferociously dedicated to the struggle of the Vietnamese people. It was only until, I have to be honest, until April 65 at the SDS March in Washington that I fully grasped the horror of the Vietnam War. And sometimes I like to say that whole story, but the great speeches that were given, transformative spoken word by Paul Potter, by Bob Moses, to really grasp the full genocide of what was happening. So I was part of the group that said Corps definitely has to take a stand against the war. That's what I believed at the time. And Ruth Turner, who we should also look up, there's a book called Harambe about Cleveland Corps. It's a great book. I read that one too. Maybe it's called Harambe City. I'll get the citation, or you can, Josh, and put it in. Cleveland Corps was a trip on itself. Corps chapters were major forces in the politics of these cities, right? They were among the leading spokespersons for the whole Black community, and they had a lot of white members and white supporters. And Ruth was one of the early advocates of Black power, of Black militancy, Black revolution. And she and a guy named Lincoln Lynch from Long Island Corps wanted to initiate a demand that Corps come out against the war in Vietnam and call for the immediate withdrawal of U.S. troops. And that sounds pretty reasonable. And certainly a civil rights group should do that. But James Farmer was the president, and the national chair, rather. And remember, he formed this thing since 1942. And he did not want that. And he pulled some parliamentary maneuvers that were not fair. I want to say that. He didn't do it right because he was afraid. I think it passed. And then he tried to undo it. Now, that was not right what he did, and that does not justify the other thing I'm trying to say, which is what the Corps chapters did not want to fully grasp is that in 1965, besides the genocide in Vietnam, the Johnson administration was moving aggressively in support of civil rights. They were about to pass the Voting Rights Act. Johnson made a great statement on affirmative action, basically saying that white people started on the 20-yard line, which is unbelievable, right? They started, in my opinion, they started on the 80-yard line, and the Black people still win the race. But it's a contradiction. Genocide in Vietnam, and at least some effort at militant civil rights in the North, in the United States. Of course, the civil rights movement had to take a stand against the war in Vietnam. I am not saying that you fight for rights in the United States and support genocide. But the question is, what is the organizational form for this? Farmer had legitimate reason to say that the cost of this resolution is Johnson is going to come down on us like gangbusters. We will not get access to the White House. We will be cut off from a lot of congressional people who are against the war already, but will not touch the war again because this is the Democrats' war. So all those options are legitimate. Corps takes the stand. And the Johnson administration comes down on them, isolates them. James Farmer is accused of being a communist. people say you didn't stay in your own lane. But civil rights have to do with Vietnam. And that's why I won't repeat, why do Black people have so many opinions on the whole world, and all the racist backlash is intensified? That's one choice. The second choice is to make a decision to say CORE cannot take this hit right now. And pushing Palmer to do it when he's the unity candidate is not a good move. And to be non-neutral, that's what I, in retrospect, believe. So what were the options? And believe me, it's not that important what I believe. I'm just trying to tell you that. The option could have been CORE chapters against the war. Cleveland CORE could take a position. Long Island CORE could take a position. Maybe, for all we know, 35 of the 100 chapters would take a position. And they could form their own something. Now, of course, that would probably lead to also a split. 35 chapters get together and they want to take a stand against the war, and Farmer doesn't. But then let's assume for a minute that they don't split CORE. And Johnson comes down on each individual chapter. And he says to Farmer, as he would, I'm not fooled by this bullshit. CORE chapter here and short. These are your people. You don't keep. If you can't keep them under control, you're not my man. Now you either repress them and get them back into shape, or you're a dead man walking, Mr. Farmer. At that point, I believe Jim Farmer would have sided with the chapters. I do. In great pain. Because Farmer was a pretty decent guy. He was not a Black militant. And he didn't support the Stalin. But after the Stalin, he did appoint Oliver Leeds to the National Action Council. He did bring in Herb Callender from Fox Court. He did bring in Lou Smith from Philly Corps. They were all the Black militants of all ironies hired me. What is my point? Carl wanted to hold the organization together, and he was right. When you have a lot of factions, until they go after each other's tendencies, you have to sit down with them and say, look, this structure can only hold this much. I'm not against you forming a different form of organization. And maybe I'll say, don't use the CORE name, call yourself Black. And then Broken Core would say, hell, no, we agree National CORE won't do it. We are Broken Core, and we'll split off CORE before, well, this is our name, we built it. And Farmer would know. I'm trying to talk about not the answer, but the process. The process is people of goodwill are trying to solve a damn problem. The strategy said today is nonprofit. There's some things we will do and some things we don't do. But if we want to do it, we just form something else. Everybody knows that, like Leanne Hurst-Mann, she formed something called the Program Demand Group. And the Program Demand Group said, we make these demands against U.S. imperialism. We met separately. We did not use any strategy center money. But it said, this is being written. The vast majority of people signing on to this are members of the labor community strategy center. We did not disassociate ourselves from the strategy center. Leanne was one of the heads of political education. But it created a genuine, honest, not pretend, distinction. So let's say the funders, I have a much more positive view of the funders than some people do. The funders call me up and say, Eric, I see you published this thing about imperialism and Palestine and capitalism. I can't support this. And you're getting money from my foundation. It's going to come back and nail it. And I say, it wasn't done. The Program Demand Group is not part of the strategy. It's separate. It's funded by us, done on our spare time. You can tell your board not a penny of your money is used to it. Now, it's the same concept. If the board says, I don't give a damn, the strategy center people wrote it, and I find this distinction not relevant, we were not willing to capitulate to that. And we were good. We got it, not just got away with it. A lot of people in the funding world liked what we did. How's that? And they were just happy to say, all right, to our board, look, guys, they know the rules, they know how to play it, and that's the story. And we have not been repressed financially, which doesn't mean someday we won't. So thanks for letting me, what I'm getting to is this. Every organization has a capacity to take a hit. Every organization has to figure out the parameters of what it can really historically do. So if an organization is there to be called fairness for the protesters, civil rights and civil liberties for the protesters, and they say, this is not about our position on Palestine or Israel, but we are deeply concerned that people are protesting against what they believe is genocide in Palestine are getting kicked out of Colombia, threatened, beaten by the police. We strongly oppose that. That's a gift. And if somebody goes in and says, no, you didn't take a stand against Palestine, or whatever, give these people a break. They are exactly what we need. And if you ask people to do more than they can do in a structure that cannot afford the hit, you destroy any chance of winning. So in retrospect, Farmer won the argument. People were angry, but they didn't quit. But this was the beginning of the end of CORE, because the split over Black power, over the working class, over the Black poor, over the relationship to the Democratic Party, all reflected in this conversation, were coming to a boil. And throughout the movement, these struggles were going to lead to splits, tendencies, factions. I really wish that we could have found ways for people to grasp how much we were friends and allies, and we could have disagreements on Black power, disagreements on whether you wanted white members, disagreements on the war, and we could find different forms to carry out our views, but that we would grasp how incredible it was to have. And I think when people break apart organizations and split organizations, man, you're destroying something beautiful that you helped to build.